The galaxy's last hope. The galaxy was dying. It had been a long, slow descent into chaos ever since the HFY Empire began its invasion. Once proud civilizations now lay in ruins. Planets that had thrived with life were now nothing but ash. The Tyrex, a ruthless alien species with advanced technology and an insatiable thirst for conquest, had already crushed the majority of the galaxy's defenses, and humanity was losing the war. In the final days of their resistance, the last remaining human fleet was scattered, fighting desperate battles to protect the few worlds still under human control. Earth was lost, a burning memory on the horizon. Most of humanity had been driven into the dark corners of the universe, seeking refuge wherever they could find it. The war seemed over, but deep in the shadow of Jupiter, a secret fleet had been waiting. Hidden, undetected, a force powerful enough to turn the tide, but only if the timing was right. Commander David Blackstone stood in the control room of the flagship Eclipse. He gazed out at the vast expanse of space through the viewport. The massive planet Jupiter loomed in the distance, its swirling storms casting a long shadow over the fleet. To the untrained eye, the fleet was nothing more than a collection of small damaged ships, remnants of humanity's once great naval force. But hidden beneath their rusted exteriors and battle-worn hulls were the greatest weapons humanity had ever created. These ships were not just any warships. They were designed to be the last hope for mankind, if ever the HFY Empire grew too strong. David's mind raced as he studied the incoming data. The HFY were approaching, their massive warships on a direct course for the last human-held planet, Velanine. The planet was humanity's final stronghold. If it fell, there would be nothing left. The remaining forces could only fight a losing battle. The HFY would destroy them all. Commander, we have received new intel. The HFY fleet is advancing. They're expecting little resistance. Lieutenant Sarah Miller's voice broke through David's thoughts. David turned to her, his expression hardening. He knew what that meant. That HFY were overconfident. They thought they had already won the war. And in a way, they were right. But what they didn't know was that humanity's hidden fleet, still concealed in the shadows of Jupiter, was their last hope. A fleet that could match the HFY in firepower. A fleet that had been kept in secret, its existence unknown to all, but a select few. David took a deep breath and turned to face his crew. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew that this could be their final mission, the last stand for humanity. But there was hope, a flicker of it, in the form of the fleet they had hidden from the HFY for so long. "We move now," David said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "This is it, the final battle. We need to hit them hard and fast. We can't afford to wait any longer." The crew nodded, their faces set with determination. They all knew the risks. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but this was humanity's last shot. If they failed, there would be nothing left. The war would be lost. The galaxy would fall under the iron fist of the HFY. David turned back to the view screen. His eyes locked on the distant horizon of Jupiter, a planet that had long been a symbol of humanity's endurance. For years, it had hidden them, its vast atmosphere concealing their movements from the HFY. But now, the time had come. The shadow of Jupiter would no longer be a place of refuge. It would be the place where humanity made its stand. Bring the fleet to battle decisions, initiate the attack sequence, and prepare for what's to come. As the crew worked in unison to prepare the fleet for battle, David couldn't shake the feeling that this would be the fight of their lives. That HFY had underestimated humanity. They had been so sure that the war was theirs to win. But they had forgotten one crucial thing: humanity's will to survive. For all the destruction, for all the losses, humanity had always found a way to fight back. And this time, they would do it in the shadow of the largest planet in the solar system. This would be their final chance. The hum of the engines echoed through the ship as the fleet powered up, ready for the strike. They would emerge from Jupiter's shadow, hidden no longer, and take the fight to the Hyderex. The outcome of the war rested on their shoulders. But David Blackstone, the commander of the Hidden Fleet, was not afraid. He had led his people through the darkest times, and he would lead them now. The fleet slowly began to move, cutting through the cold, dark expanse of space. They were ready, and as they emerged from the shadow of Jupiter, a new chapter in the war began. The Hyderex would soon learn that humanity's hidden fleet was not just a myth. It was real, and it was ready to change the tide of the war. But the question remained, would it be enough? A shocking discovery. The fleet was now fully prepared, its engines roaring to life as they moved closer to their target. Commander David Blackstone stood on the bridge of the Eclipse, his eyes fixed on the monitors ahead. The Hyderex were coming, their massive warships closing in on Velenine. The final battle was near. Commander, the Hyderex fleet is within range. Lieutenant Sarah Miller reported, her voice steady, but filled with tension. We can engage them at any moment. David nodded, but something in his gut told him that this mission wouldn't be as simple as they'd hoped. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the Hidden Fleet, while powerful, had never been tested against an enemy this strong. As the fleet prepared to attack, Lieutenant Miller was deep in thought. She had been working on something unusual, something that had been kept secret from even the highest-ranking officers on the Eclipse, the hidden weapon aboard the fleet. It was supposed to be a last resort, an ultimate weapon designed to destroy the Hyderex once and for all. But why had it been kept a secret? Why hadn't they used it sooner? While the rest of the crew focused on preparing for the battle, Sarah went to the command console, her fingers moving swiftly over the keys. She entered a series of complex codes, accessing a hidden layer of the fleet's system. It was risky. If anyone found out, it could mean trouble. But her curiosity got the better of her. She needed to know what was hidden beneath the surface. The console beeped, and a new screen appeared in front of her. It was an encrypted log, containing information about the weapon that had been kept in the fleet's arsenal for years. Sarah's eyes widened as she read through the data. What she discovered shocked her. The weapon wasn't just any bomb or missile. It was something far more dangerous. According to the logs, it was a device that could channel the energy of a star, turning it into a destructive force capable of obliterating entire fleets in an instant. But there was a catch. The weapon was unstable. It had never been fully tested, and using it could destroy the entire fleet if something went wrong. Sarah's heart raced. This weapon could save humanity, but it could also wipe them out. She knew she had to tell David, but how would he react? Could they risk using such a dangerous weapon when the fate of the entire fleet and the entire human race was at stake? As Sarah walked towards David's command chair, her mind raced. She found him standing by the viewport, watching the Hyderex fleet grow larger as they approached Velenine. The moment of truth was fast approaching. "Commander, I need to talk to you," Sarah said, her voice urgent. David turned to face her, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it, Lieutenant?" he asked. Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's something you need to know about the weapon we've been hiding on this fleet. It's more powerful than we thought. It's not just a weapon. It could end the war. But it's unstable. If we use it, we might lose everything. The entire fleet could be destroyed." David's eyes narrowed. He had heard rumors about the weapon, but he hadn't known the full extent of its power or its danger. He stared at Sarah, processing the information. The fate of the war and the future of humanity was in their hands. "Are you sure about this?" David asked. Sarah nodded. "I'm sure. But we have to decide. Do we use it, or do we risk everything on the battle ahead?" David stood in silence, his mind working through the possibilities. He knew that the Hyderex were too powerful to defeat with conventional weapons, but using the weapon could be a gamble that might destroy them all. "We don't have time to debate," David finally said. "Prepare the weapon, but keep it in reserve for now. If we need it, we'll use it. but we'll hold off until the moment comes." Sarah nodded, her face tense. She knew the decision had been made, but the uncertainty of it still lingered in the air. She quickly made her way to the weapons console to prepare the device. Meanwhile, David gathered the rest of the crew for the upcoming battle. The fleet's weapons systems powered up, and David took his seat at the command center, his mind focused on the task at hand. The HFYs were closing in fast. Soon, they would be within firing range. He gave the order to attack, and the fleet surged forward, weapons blazing. As the battle began, the Eclipse and the other ships launched a wave of firepower at the oncoming HFY forces. The energy shields of the HFY ships flickered as the human fleet's lasers and missiles hit their targets. But the HFYs quickly countered, retaliating with devastating blasts of their own. The battle was fierce, and the human fleet was taking heavy damage. "Commander, we're being overwhelmed," Lieutenant Miller called out. "We need to fall back." David's mind raced. They were losing. The weapon was their only hope. It was time to make the call. "Activate the weapon," he ordered, his voice calm but filled with urgency. Sarah's hands flew over the console as the weapon powered up. The energy began to build, swirling in the core of the fleet's central ship. It was unstable, dangerous, but it was their last chance. The fleet's final weapon was about to be unleashed. Preparing for the strike, the battle raged on as David Blackstone stood at the heart of the Eclipse's command center. The distant roar of energy blasts filled the room, echoing like the sound of a dying star. His crew was doing everything they could to hold off the Tyrex Empire, but it wasn't enough. The human fleet was outgunned, and their ships were taking heavy fire. If they didn't do something drastic soon, the entire fleet would be destroyed, and humanity's last hope would vanish into the void of space. "Commander," Lieutenant Sarah Miller's voice broke through the noise, her face grim. "We've sustained significant damage. The HFYs are pushing us back. Our shields won't hold much longer." David clenched his fists, his eyes narrowing. He knew the stakes, and they were dire. But there was still one chance. They had prepared for this moment for years, hidden away in the shadows of Jupiter. A weapon so powerful that it could wipe out the HFY fleet in a single blow. It had been humanity's secret weapon, a final resort that could tip the scales in their favor. But now, they were at the point where it had to be used. He turned to Sarah, his voice calm but heavy with resolve. "It's time. Prepare the weapon for launch." Sarah hesitated for just a moment, a look of doubt crossing her face. She had worked with the weapon, but the fear of its power still haunted her. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a force of nature. Unstable, unpredictable, and dangerous. Using it was a gamble. One that could destroy everything they had worked for. But there was no choice now. "Understood, Commander," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear that lurked beneath. She quickly moved to the console and began inputting commands. The room hummed with the energy of the weapon, its systems slowly coming to life. It was ready, but only for a moment. As Sarah worked, David couldn't help but think of the people who had sacrificed so much to get to this point. The families, the soldiers, the civilians, all of them had hoped that humanity's hidden fleet would be their salvation. Now it was up to him to make sure that hope didn't die here, in the cold depths of space, surrounded by a fleet of alien conquerors. The ship shuddered as another blast struck its side, and alarms blared. "Commander, we've lost power to the aft generators," Lieutenant Miller shouted. "We can't hold them off much longer." David's mind raced. They were running out of time. The weapon had to be activated before the HFYs could land the final blow. He turned to his crew, his voice booming in the chaos. "Hold the line. We need a few more minutes." The crew responded with determination, firing back at the HFY ships. The Eclipse rocked again, and sparks flew from the consoles as they tried to push the enemy back. But even with their best efforts, the HFY fleet was too large, too powerful. It was clear that the time for conventional warfare was over. The only hope now rested on the secret weapon. "Weapon ready, Commander," Sarah called out, her voice tense, but resolute. "We're ready to fire." David took a deep breath, his mind clear despite the chaos. He knew this was the moment. There was no turning back. With a single order, humanity's last chance would be unleashed. "Fire the weapon," David commanded. The entire ship shook as the weapon powered up, its energy surging to unimaginable levels. The core of the Eclipse blazed with light as the weapon's energy was channeled through the fleet. A beam of pure, raw power shot from the ship's main cannon, streaking through the void of space like a blazing comet. For a moment, everything went silent. Time seemed to slow as the beam hit the Kyrex fleet. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The leading HFY ship erupted in a burst of flame and debris, its massive hull torn apart as if it were paper. The shockwave spread, hitting several more ships and obliterating them in a chain reaction. The sheer power of the blast left a trail of destruction that the HFY could not have anticipated. The remaining HFY ships faltered, disoriented and scrambling to recover from the sudden onslaught. The human fleet had taken a heavy beating, but now they had the upper hand. Direct hit. The weapon worked. Sarah shouted in disbelief. "The Kyrex fleet is retreating." David's heart raced with adrenaline, but he knew better than to celebrate. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The weapon had proven its power, but it had also come at a cost. The Eclipse was heavily damaged, and many other ships in the fleet had taken significant hits. They had to regroup and quickly. "Status report," David barked. "We've lost 2/3 of our fleet," Sarah responded. "The weapon's energy drained most of our power, but the HFY are in full retreat. We've driven them back for now." David nodded, his mind still processing everything. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We need to regroup. Don't let them take advantage of our weakness." As the fleet moved to a safer position, David couldn't help but feel the weight of their victory. And their losses. The weapon had worked, but at what cost? The HFY might have retreated, but they wouldn't stay away for long. The battle had only just begun. David turned his gaze toward the blackness of space, where Jupiter's shadow still loomed. The final fight was still ahead, and the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. But for now, humanity had a glimmer of hope. The hidden fleet, and the weapon that had changed the course of the war, had given them a fighting chance. But there was one question still lingering in David's mind. Could they survive the next assault? The tide turns. The aftermath of the battle was a chaotic blur. The once proud fleet, battered and broken, limped back to its hidden stronghold in the shadow of Jupiter. Commander David Blackstone stood at the center of the bridge, his hands clenched tightly behind his back as he watched the stars stretch across the viewport. The silence in the command room felt suffocating, oppressive even. The victory had been hard-earned, and the costs were heavy. "Commander, we've driven the Kyrex back." Lieutenant Sarah Miller's voice echoed in the stillness, a soft but noticeable relief in her tone. "But we've taken severe damage. Our fleet's capability to fight is severely diminished." David nodded, feeling the weight of every word. The weapon they had used to strike the HFY had brought the immediate relief they so desperately needed, but it had come with a price. The energy surge had drained the fleet's power reserves almost entirely. They could no longer continue the fight at full strength. What they had left were crippled ships and a fleet in desperate need of repairs. "We're not out of the woods yet," David said, his voice hardening with determination. "The HFY will come back, and when they do, we need to be ready." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "We can't afford to wait for them to strike first, Commander. We have to prepare ourselves, even if it means pushing the limits of our resources." David glanced at the crew around him, his trusted officers who had seen humanity through its darkest days. They all knew the stakes. Their war, their survival, depended on what happened next. "We'll give ourselves 3 days for repairs," David decided, and then we move out. We'll take the fight to that T-Rex, and we'll do it on our terms." "Understood, Commander," Sarah replied, her voice resolute. 3 days passed in a blur of mechanical repairs and strategic planning. The fleet's engineers worked tirelessly, patching up the damaged ships and recharging what remained of their power. But as the hours passed, David couldn't shake the feeling of unease that hung over him. The X-Rex were not a race that would simply back down. They would regroup, adapt, and come at them with renewed strength. The fleet was ready, or as ready as they could be. "Commander," Sarah called, her voice interrupting his thoughts. "We've received a transmission from the T-Rex. They want to negotiate a ceasefire." David froze for a moment, taken aback. A ceasefire? After the destruction they had just unleashed upon the T-Rex fleet, they were asking for peace. "Negotiation," David scoffed. "They're not here to talk, Sarah. This is a tactic. They're trying to buy time. Don't let them fool you." "I don't trust them, Commander," Sarah said, a hint of anger in her tone. "But their fleet is formidable. If we're going to survive this, we may need to hear them out. For now." David turned to face his lieutenant, his gaze unwavering. "I'll hear them out, but if they make one false move, we strike. I won't let them manipulate us into a false sense of security." He turned to the communications officer. "Open the channel." The screen flickered to life, and an image of a X-Rex commander appeared on the screen. His face was cold, devoid of emotion, as he spoke in a deep, guttural voice. "Commander Blackstone," that X-Rex commander began, "we acknowledge your strength and your weapon. You have shown us that humanity is not to be underestimated. We are prepared to negotiate. We propose a ceasefire and the start of peace talks. The destruction we've caused to your fleet was regrettable." David's fists clenched. "Peace talks?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. "You've killed millions of my people, destroyed entire planets, and you think we'll talk now?" The X-Rex commander's gaze did not waver. "We acknowledge the losses, Commander. But you are fighting a losing battle. The war is over. Humanity's future is ours to decide. We offer you peace in exchange for your surrender." David's mind raced. He knew this was a trap. That X-Rex were not interested in peace. They never were. They wanted humanity to surrender, to kneel before them, and to accept their domination. "You're wasting your time," David said, his voice firm. "Humanity will never surrender to you. Not now. Not ever." The X-Rex commander's expression remained unchanged. "Then the war will continue, and more will die. We have the power to destroy you. The weapon you used was impressive, but it will not be enough." David's jaw tightened. "We'll see about that. Your threat doesn't scare us." With that, he cut the transmission. David turned to his officers, his mind made up. "We're not taking the bait. The X-Rex want us to surrender. They want to break our spirit, but we won't give in. We will strike first, and we will finish this war on our terms." Sarah gave him a sharp nod. "The fleet is ready, Commander. We can engage them at any time." "Then let's finish what we started," David said, his voice hard as steel. The fleet moved out from the shadow of Jupiter, emerging into the vast emptiness of space, ready for the next phase of the battle. That X-Rex had made a fatal mistake by underestimating humanity's resolve. They may have had the firepower, but humanity had something the X-Rex could never understand: an unbreakable will to survive. And in that moment, as the fleet accelerated toward the heart of the T-Rex Empire, David Blackstone knew that the tide of war had truly begun to turn. The fight for the galaxy was far from over, but humanity's final stand had just begun. The last offensive. The quiet hum of the Eclipse's engines filled the bridge, and Commander David Blackstone stood before the viewscreen, his eyes focused on the distant stars ahead. The silence was heavy, but his mind was anything but still. That X-Rex had refused humanity's demand for peace, and now there was only one option left: total war. With the fleet patched up as best as possible, it was time to strike. David felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The fate of humanity rested on their ability to press the advantage they had gained. That Cyrex had retreated, but it was only temporary. They would regroup, reorganize, and return stronger than before. But David couldn't let them have that chance. This was their one shot at ending the war before the Cyrex could mount another assault. He turned to his officers. "We move now. We've fought long enough on the defensive. It's time to take the fight to them. We hit their core worlds, their strongholds. We go for the heart." Sarah Miller stepped forward, a grim look on her face. "Sir, our fleet is still recovering. The damage from the previous battle will take time to fully repair. We're not at full strength yet." David nodded. "I know, but we can't afford to wait. Every moment we delay gives the Tyrex time to rebuild. We strike now, or we risk everything." "Understood, Commander," Sarah replied, a hint of hesitation in her voice. But she knew there was no turning back. The command center came alive with the sound of voices and rapid typing as the crew prepared for the offensive. The fleet, though battered, was ready to move. Each ship had its orders, and the target was clear: the Cyrex capital. If they could hit that, they could cripple the Empire's ability to continue the war. The Cyrex had to be taken down, and this was humanity's last chance. The fleet moved in silence, cloaked in the shadow of Jupiter's massive size, making their way toward the heart of enemy space. The journey felt like a lifetime, each moment dragging with the weight of uncertainty. But David's resolve only hardened as they neared their destination. This wasn't just about victory anymore. It was about survival. The Cyrex fleet had once been thought invincible, their ships powerful beyond comprehension. But humanity had shown them that they could bleed, that they could be wounded, and that they could be driven back. Now, with the secret weapon of the Eclipse and the remaining strength of the fleet, they were ready to finish what they had started. "Commander, we've detected a large Cyrex fleet near the capital." Sarah's voice broke through the tension, her face appearing on the tactical screen. "It's larger than anything we've encountered so far. They're preparing for a final defense." David's eyes narrowed. That Cyrex were not going to give up without a fight. He had expected this, but the size of the enemy fleet still shocked him. This is it. Full speed ahead. No turning back. The fleet surged forward, breaking through the final lines of defense. The Eclipse led the charge, its engines roaring as it sliced through the darkness, leaving a trail of brilliance in its wake. The enemy fleet was massive, but David didn't hesitate. They would have to fight with everything they had. The battle began with the roar of weapons fire, the sky above rippling with energy blasts. Human ships darted through the chaos, using their speed and agility to outmaneuver the larger Cyrex vessels. Despite the damage they had sustained, humanity's fleet was more than capable of delivering devastating blows. David's heart raced as the battle unfolded before him. He watched as the first Cyrex ships fell, their hulking forms bursting into flames and debris. The shockwave from the destruction sent ripples through the space surrounding them. For every Cyrex ship that fell, the human fleet's morale soared. The odds were still against them, but the tide had truly turned. "We've got them on the run, Commander," shouted one of the bridge officers. "The Cyrex fleet is falling back." David took a deep breath. It was working, but he couldn't afford to celebrate just yet. The Cyrex were relentless. If they couldn't break their will now, all of this would have been for nothing. "Keep pushing forward," David ordered. "Don't let them regroup. This ends today." As the battle raged on, the Cyrex capital came into view. The massive dark planet loomed ominously ahead, a reminder of the power the Empire had amassed. But humanity had arrived with a single purpose: to end this war, to end their reign of terror. "Commander, we're in range of the capital," Sarah called out. "The main shield array is online, but it's weak. We can disable it with a direct hit." David didn't hesitate. Fire everything we've got." The Eclipse's main cannon unleashed another surge of power, a beam of pure energy streaking through the void. The blast collided with the Kyrex capital's shield, sending a ripple of distortion across the planet's surface. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze in time. Then, the planet's shield collapsed, and the Eclipse fired again, this time directly into the heart of the capital. The explosion was massive, sending shockwaves through the atmosphere. The Hyrex fleet faltered, and a wave of panic spread among the remaining forces. Their greatest stronghold had been crippled, and they had no way to fight back. The battle was over. David stood at the bridge, watching as the remnants of the Hyrex fleet began to retreat into the darkness of space. Their once proud ships were now broken, scattered, and fleeing. The war was finally over. But as the adrenaline began to subside, David couldn't help but feel the weight of the victory settle on his shoulders. The cost had been high, but humanity had survived. The fleet was battered, but their spirit was unbroken. They had taken the fight to the enemy, and won. David turned to Sarah, his voice quieter now. "We've done it. The war is over." She nodded, a tired but proud smile on her face. "We survived, Commander. Humanity survived." And for the first time in a long while, David allowed himself to believe in that truth. Humanity had stood strong against that Hyrex, and against all odds, they had won. The battle for the galaxy was over, and now, a new future lay before them. The aftermath of victory. The cold expanse of space felt different now. Where there had once been the distant hum of battle, the silence now stretched out, vast and empty. The Eclipse and the other ships of humanity's fleet floated in the quiet, their forms battered but triumphant. The Hyrex fleet had retreated, broken, and their capital lay in ruin. The war was over. But as the stars twinkled in the distance, Commander David Blackstone felt no peace. The victory was a hollow one. They had destroyed the heart of the Hyrex Empire, but the cost had been steep, too steep. Countless lives had been lost, entire worlds reduced to ashes. The galaxy would never be the same again. David stood alone on the bridge of the Eclipse, staring out into the abyss. The war had taken everything from him: his friends, his comrades, and his sense of peace. Now that the battle was won, he could no longer ignore the emptiness that lingered inside him. "Commander," Sarah Miller's voice broke through his thoughts. She stepped onto the bridge, her face tired but resolute. "The fleet is secure. We've accounted for the majority of casualties, and we've sent word to the surviving colonies. We've won. The war is over." David nodded, but the weight of her words didn't lift the heaviness in his chest. "Yes, we've won," he muttered. "But at what cost?" Sarah's gaze softened. "I know what you mean, Commander. So many lives lost. But we couldn't have fought any other way. The Hyrex were going to destroy us if we didn't stand up to them." David's eyes hardened, and he turned to face her. "I don't care what they were going to do, Sarah. I care about the people we lost. The civilians, the soldiers, they're gone, and we'll never get them back." There was a long pause before Sarah spoke again. "And we have to live with that. But we also have to remember why we fought. We fought for the future, for the generations to come. We fought so that humanity could survive." David's gaze softened as he looked at her. "You're right, of course, but it doesn't make it any easier." Over the next few days, the fleet began to move back toward human space. The damage to their ships was severe, and the surviving crew members were exhausted, both physically and mentally. The entire fleet had been stretched to its limits, and now that the battle was over, the soldiers needed rest. But the reality of the galaxy they had saved was just beginning to set in. David spent much of his time in the war room, reviewing reports, speaking with his officers, and coordinating with the surviving colonies. The Hyrex may have been defeated, but their influence would still linger in the galaxy for a long time. There was no going back to the way things were before. The destruction they had caused would leave scars that might never fully heal. He glanced at the latest report, detailing the devastation of the outer colonies, worlds that had been devastated by Xyrex occupation, their people enslaved or slaughtered. There was a list of cities lost, families torn apart, and entire populations wiped from existence. The damage was unimaginable, and rebuilding would take decades. The war had cost so much more than just lives. It had taken entire ways of life, cultures, and histories. "Commander, we've just received word from the Xyrex," Sarah said, entering the room. "They're asking for a formal surrender. They've admitted defeat and are willing to negotiate terms for peace." David looked up at her, his expression unreadable. That Xyrex had finally realized the inevitable. They had been beaten. But a surrender meant something far different now than it would have before the war had started. He didn't trust them, not one bit. They had never been interested in peace before, and David had no reason to believe they suddenly were now. "I'll meet with them," David said after a long pause, his voice steady. "But we need to make sure they understand the terms. This is not going to be some simple treaty. They've lost, and they need to accept the consequences of their actions." The meeting with the Xyrex ambassador took place in the war room of the Eclipse. The envoy, a tall, pale figure with an air of arrogance, stood at attention, flanked by 2 guards. He met David's gaze with a cold, emotionless stare. "You have destroyed our empire," the ambassador said in a deep, almost disinterested voice. "We acknowledge your victory. You will now be given what you want. But know this, we will rebuild. We are not finished." David's eyes narrowed. "You can rebuild all you want, but there will be no more conquests, no more destruction, no more oppression. You will leave humanity alone, and you will leave the galaxy alone. This is not negotiable." The Xyrex ambassador sneered. "You may think you've won, but we are eternal. You will see." David took a step forward, his voice low but unwavering. "You're wrong. You're defeated, and your empire is done. This is your last chance to accept that. There will be no more war." The ambassador's eyes flickered with something, perhaps fear or perhaps rage, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Very well," the ambassador said, bowing slightly. "You have your terms. We will comply. For now." The Xyrex ambassador left the room, and the door closed behind him with a final thud. David stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, as Sarah and the others filed into the war room. "You think they'll hold to their word?" Sarah asked. David exhaled slowly. "I don't know, but we have to be ready for anything. The war is over, but the real work is just beginning. Rebuilding, negotiating, ensuring this doesn't happen again. This is our new battle." As the fleet returned to human space, David stood once again at the window of the Eclipse, watching the stars stretch out before him. The victory was bittersweet. Humanity had won, but the true cost of that victory would haunt them for years to come. The future was uncertain, and peace was fragile. The scars of war would never fully fade. But as long as there was hope, as long as there were survivors to rebuild, humanity would endure. And for the first time in a long while, David allowed himself to believe that they might just have a future worth fighting for. A new beginning. The peace that followed the war was not the easy, celebratory kind that people had imagined before the battle. It was quiet, tentative, and full of uncertainty. Despite the victory, the galaxy was in ruins, and humanity was no exception. Cities had been destroyed, colonies had been ravaged, and the scars of war were visible everywhere. The path ahead was unclear, but it was the only path humanity had. Commander David Blackstone stood at the front of the Grand Hall, in the newly established Peace Council headquarters, his uniform crisp and clean, though the strain of the past months was still visible in his tired eyes. Behind him, rows of delegates sat in silence, their faces a mix of hope, fear, and resolve. They were here to discuss the future of the galaxy, to determine what would happen now that the HFY were defeated and humanity had emerged victorious. "Commander," a voice called from the back of the room. It was Sarah Miller, the ever-present right-hand officer, her face marked by exhaustion, but also by determination. "The delegates are ready for the peace talks to begin." David nodded, turning slowly to face her. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice steady but weary. He knew the work was far from over. He had fought the war to save humanity, but now he had to help rebuild it. And that was going to be the hardest part. The peace talks were a series of tense negotiations, discussions that seemed to drag on endlessly as representatives from the surviving human colonies argued over what terms to accept. While some wanted to show mercy to the HFY and offer them a chance to rebuild, others demanded complete retribution. The scars from the war were still fresh, and there was no consensus on how to move forward. David had to stand firm in the face of pressure from all sides. That HFY had taken everything from humanity, and there was no way he could ignore that. They had destroyed entire worlds, enslaved billions of innocent people, and almost wiped out humanity itself. The treaty would have to be firm. It would have to prevent this from ever happening again. But David also knew that revenge could not guide the future. He had seen too much destruction. Humanity had won, yes, but it wasn't about making the HFY suffer. It was about ensuring peace for future generations. The galaxy could not afford to live in a state of constant war. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the framework for peace began to take shape. The HFY, though defeated, were forced to give up their conquests and submit to a series of strict terms. Their military would be severely restricted, and their government would be dismantled. In exchange, their people would receive protection and aid from humanity. The key to this peace was rebuilding, not destruction. David's heart was heavy as he signed the final treaty, knowing that the true challenges of peace were just beginning. The war had ended, but the work to restore the galaxy and its people would take generations. In the months that followed, David found himself spending more time among the people than on the bridge of the eclipse. He visited the colonies that had been hardest hit by the war, offering what comfort and leadership he could. He spoke to survivors, to families who had lost loved ones, to people who were struggling to rebuild. There were still so many scars, so much loss, but there was also hope. "Commander Blackstone," an older woman said as she approached him on one of the devastated worlds. "Thank you for everything." David smiled softly, though his eyes were tired. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. Humanity did this together." She nodded, looking out over the remains of the ruined city. "I know, but it was you who led us. We didn't give up because of you. We believed that we could win because you showed us how." David looked out at the ruins too. "We won, but we've got a lot of work ahead of us. Rebuilding is going to take time. But we'll do it. We'll rebuild this galaxy from the ground up, one step at a time." The HFY began their slow integration into the peace, their once powerful empire reduced to fragments. They could no longer be a threat to humanity, and over time, they came to understand the true nature of defeat. Humanity didn't seek vengeance. It sought peace, understanding, and reconstruction. But peace, David knew, would always be fragile. The threat of future wars loomed in the background, but for now, humanity had earned its place in the stars. David's final speech to the galaxy came in the aftermath of the peace talks. Standing before a vast assembly of delegates, leaders, and citizens of all races, he spoke with a quiet but firm voice. "The war is over, but our fight continues. We will rebuild what was lost. We will ensure that peace is not just a dream, but a reality. And we will not forget the lessons we've learned in this conflict, that victory is hard-won, that peace is fragile, and that the price of freedom is always high." The crowd fell silent, and then slowly applause began to ripple through the room. It was quiet at first, then grew louder, until it echoed through the chamber. Humanity had won, and they would honor those who had fought and fallen. But the true victory would come when the galaxy was rebuilt and the cycle of war was finally broken. As the applause echoed around him, David felt a sense of closure. The war was over, but he wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a leader, a guide for humanity in a new era. He could only hope that future generations would learn from the mistakes of the past and ensure that the peace they had fought for would endure. Looking out over the assembly, he saw the faces of the future, hopeful, determined, and ready to move forward. The galaxy was scared, but it was not beyond repair. And humanity, having fought and sacrificed so much, was ready to build a new world. For David Blackstone, the battle was over, but the real work was only just beginning.